back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with our 91st episode of World War III analysis as we are deep into the Third World War, specifically in the Levant. We are going to be talking about the assassination, not even really assassination, just death in battle of Yahya Sinwar, the political and military leader of Hamas, many say, who was the mastermind behind the October 7th attack onto Israel from the Gaza Strip. So very big update there, as most of the axis of resistance from Hamas to Hezbollah to even members of the IRGC and others seem to be getting decapitated one by one as Israel really ups the ante in its war. We're going to be talking about how much territory Israel has taken on the ground. We're going to be talking about their impending strike on Iran, whether that will be on nuclear capabilities, on their oil facilities, or just on military targets. We're going to be discussing all of that, as well as Russia's perspective on, of course, the strikes on potential nuclear facilities, as well as Putin's latest comments on how the Palestinians will not give up the fight, seemingly shifting more and more towards Palestine as the conflict goes on. We're going to talk about France and Italy threatening to embargo Israel, as well as the U.S. regarding the Gaza aid stuff. There are THAAD missiles and U.S. troops now on the ground in Israel. New plans about the situation in North Gaza. We're going to talk about Syria as Turkish and Russian proxies clash. We're going to be talking about situations in Ukraine with Zelensky talking about nukes. This is one of the most packed episodes in a long time, and we've had packed episodes recently regardless. So a lot of things going on. Dmitry, how are you doing? What are your thoughts as things begin to heat up around the world?
Yeah, it's good to be here, Conrad. Thank you for the introduction. It's been a crazy week, as per usual. Things are just always heating up, becoming more complex. And this will be one of those more complex episodes because the Middle East at the moment is really in a state of extreme crisis, as we've seen recently with the death of various leaders of the axis of resistance. And another has joined the ranks, of course, the death of Yahya Sinwar. I think it's worth beginning the discussion with his killing by Israeli troops. And now they've taken his body, most likely for an autopsy or even an examination. We're not sure what these Israeli officials do with the bodies of their deceased opponents, right? Going back in history, I think there's a few examples of what may actually take place. But regardless of that, we see Yahya Sinwar, right? The current leader of Hamas. He grew up in Khan Yunis in Gaza, Palestine. He's not someone who was a Iranian handler of Hamas. He's not somebody from the outside. He's literally blood and bone from that region, from Gaza, Palestine, not even from the West Bank. He's specifically a Gaza Palestinian. And it's really interesting how he grew up in essentially an environment of conflict. He was only 10 years old during the Yom Kippur War, very, very young. And when you grow up in that sort of environment of constant conflict, that is the particular mindset that you're raised with. And generally, his talents really proved themselves as a manager and as a militant, right, fighting against Israel for decades now, at least. And finally, Israel have taken him out officially. We've seen many, of course, unfortunately, gloating comments from very pro-Israeli philo-Semitic spokespersons, including those unfortunately somewhat related to Christian spokespersons such as Rod Dreher, and even I would say Donald Trump, who still somewhat considers himself a Christian, claiming that Yahya Sinwar died like a dog, and all kinds of other interesting comments coming out from allegedly Christian spokespersons who are really displaying their pro-Zionism, which is very bizarre. And in fact, myself and Conrad, we're not pro-Hamas by any stance or any stretch of the imagination, but to view this conflict outside of the general context of Palestinian oppression is extremely wrong. And even Yahya Sinwar, he is a product of the oppression of the Palestinian people. He grew up in this environment. He was raised in it. And his killing, in detail, most of you have probably seen the video. Essentially, he was actually in Rafah, in the refugee camp, in that particular zone in southern Palestine. So he was with his people the entire time. He did not leave to go to Qatar. He didn't leave to travel to Lebanon or to seek safety in Iran somewhere. And I'm not saying Ismail Haniyeh was doing the same. Ismail Haniyeh was very much a diplomatic leader of Hamas, right? Very different, perhaps, because Sinwar was, you can say, the political, probably right-wing, pro-military leader of Hamas, whereas Ismail Haniyeh was more or less the maybe more diplomatic, more dovish side of the Hamas leadership. And still, we see Yahya Sinwar, allegedly, Conrad, he was planning to have discussions to actually release some of the hostages and have hostage exchanges take place, and still Israel still went in for the kill. They identified the house he was staying in. First they bombed it, and they sent in a drone, and then they finished him off with an attack from, I believe it was a sniper bullet finished him off, allegedly as per Israeli footage and their reports. So we see another leader of Hamas fall, another leader of the Axis of Resistance, and it's quite curious as to what the reaction of the allies will be. We're in a sort of scenario, Conrad, where we see the death of Ismail Haniyeh literally in Tehran, in what should be one of the safest places in the Middle East for the leaders of the Axis. We see the death of Nasrallah, and what becomes very evident, I think, to all of our listeners and even to us as we analyze these events is that there is no dead man's switch that takes place. There is no, okay, if so-and-so leader gets taken out, a certain cascading of events takes place, a certain domino effect. There will be a plan B, there'll be a new leader that steps in. You see that once these leaders fall, not only are they not replaced by anyone more competent than them, typically they're replaced, there are replacements, and I'm sure somebody new will take command of Hamas very shortly, and the announcements will, of course, spread all over the internet. But will they be more capable than Yahya Sinwar? I'm somewhat doubtful, because you see someone in such a position of leadership. It's really interesting. I doubt he'll be replaced by somebody of more capacity than him. And there doesn't seem to be any way Hamas, Hezbollah, the Axis could retaliate and strike out against the IDF or do anything in a similar capacity, right? Strike out against one of the IDF military chiefs. There's no plan B. There's no way of actually taking out a strike of vengeance against their opponents, which is quite interesting. And it's somewhat bleak, I would say, for the Axis.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. And most people are talking about the drone video showing Sinwar's final moments where he's sitting up. Clearly his arm has already been blown off. He's made a makeshift wire tourniquet and he threw a piece of wood at the drone. The story says that he was throwing grenades down at Israeli troops that were storming him. And again, some of these say that even his group of Hamas soldiers fired on the Israeli battalion first. That again, this wasn't some kind of intelligence assassination. This was just, he was on the front lines fighting in the battle, as many are saying. Because again, he wasn't the political leader living in Qatar like Ismail Haniyeh was. Sinwar was the head of the actual on the ground Hamas situation. He was the military mastermind supposedly behind October 7th. So he was fighting on the ground. And again, this guy's 61, 62 years old. And people are debating online whether or not this was brave or whether or not, on the one hand, yes, clearly he's a brave guy. He went out fighting as opposed to being in a bunker like a lot of these other people, I'm not even hating on the people who are being in bunkers. If you're being stalked by the Israeli intelligence and military, then I'd hide in a bunker too. But perhaps it seems like he put himself in this situation because he would rather have gone out this way after decades of fighting against Israel. But unfortunately, the rumor is that 22 out of 24 of the Hamas battalions have been completely wiped out, that there's disarray within the organization at this point, that people in Gaza aren't even seeing Hamas anymore wherever they are. So it seems that there is large-scale Israeli victory, and we are now hearing about the Israeli plan to annex North Gaza, which basically seems that they've cut the Gaza Strip in half with occupation, and there's a full plan to annex and occupy North Gaza permanently. I don't know if that, it seems to me that that's just going to eventually go down to Khan Yunis and down to Rafah, just like the invasion did. All those red lines got crossed with an invasion of Rafah, the Philadelphia crossing getting occupied by Israeli soldiers, of course, doing to Khan Yunis what they'd already done to Gaza City. All of these things have all came to pass. So if the Israeli army is already planning to occupy northern Gaza permanently, and the U.S. has tacitly agreed to that, then, of course, obviously they're going to be able to eventually do the same things to Khan Yunis and then all the way down to Rafah and occupy the entire strip and complete their genocide and ethnic cleansing and push all of the Palestinians out. And this comes at the same time as they're moving into the region of Lebanon south of the Litani River, and as Bezalel Smotrich and everybody else talks about annexing the West Bank, as Trump potentially wins the election with Miriam Adelson's money with the blessing explicitly to do just that, to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. So it's really not looking good for the Palestinians right now. The situation in Lebanon is a bit different, but unfortunately, the axis of resistance at a leadership level has taken a lot of hits. And Hamas itself, the Gaza Strip specifically, is not looking good. We have threats from the U.S. they say to arms embargo Israel if they don't expedite aid to Gaza in the next 30 days, because the Israelis are literally preventing any kind of aid from going in there. It's just a full-on demonic genocide, frankly. But the U.S. really isn't serious about that threat, in my opinion. If anything, Italy and France are more serious about their threats to embargo Israel as well on the Mediterranean because of the strikes on the UNIFIL UN authorities in Lebanon, which, again, we know France and Italy have a lot of people that contribute to those type of forces. We know that these were Irish forces that were fired on, but Macron is motivated, obviously, against Israel after Israel, struck these French-owned gas stations and are clearly indicating that they don't think that France is using its colonial influence over Lebanon in a way that they approve of to, completely zog out Lebanon and drive out Hezbollah. But again, we're going to have to talk about some of these potential contingency plans that the Iranians are talking about, which it doesn't look very good for the axis of resistance again. So as much as, we are awaiting these Israeli strikes, we do see the fact that Iran has talked about, they're going to strike back twice as hard if Israel does certain things. So everybody's again waiting at the edge of their seat for that to happen. At the same time, Hezbollah has announced that they are taking the war to another level. Ever since Yahya Sinwar has died, there seems to be a desire with whoever is currently now occupying the leadership positions across the different battalions of Hezbollah that are engaging Israeli forces on the ground in the south of Lebanon. It seems that they have decided to escalate it. There's rumors that Hezbollah has made incursions into Israel, that they have taken their troops and crossed the border into Israel and are escalating the fighting there. We have more and more missiles hitting Haifa and hitting Kiryat Shmona as well and these other places. There's Hezbollah videos being released about how they will make Haifa look like Kiryat Shmona, because most people have had to leave Kiryat Shmona and these other cities in the north, which has been the Israeli military goal. They've said, we're going to return all 60,000 plus, it may even be more than that, hundreds of thousands at this point, plus Israeli civilians to their homes in the north, which involves setting up a big buffer zone. Right now, they're claiming they just want a 10-kilometer buffer zone in the south of Lebanon, but as of right now, it seems that they're only occupying in total 37.5 square kilometers. They haven't taken that many towns in total. They are, raising flags over certain city centers and over certain water towers and whatnot. But on the outside of all of these towns, Hezbollah is still fighting. There are rumors that the town of Ramesh, the Maronite Christians there let the Israelis in and are totally helping them and are, welcoming Israeli quote unquote liberation from the Shia and the Hezbollah occupation, as they claim, which I don't know exactly how accurate that is, but I have seen some fairly convincing images. So a lot of things going on in this region for sure. All the meanwhile, the U.S. has sent their THAAD missiles to Israel to defend against the potential Iranian response to their strikes, which again, supposedly Biden told the Israelis that striking their nuclear facilities are off limits. Putin has said the same thing, that Israel cannot strike Iran's nuclear capabilities. And remember the prophecies that when the Jews do strike those capabilities, Russia and China will be forced to respond. We're going to get into a bit of deep geopolitical analysis on that in a moment, but that's why those THAAD missiles are there. That's why over 100 U.S. troops are on the ground in Israel right now to operate those systems, and Israel has asked for a second one. So by the time you're listening to this, the U.S. may have sent a second one over there. So a lot of big things happening. The powder keg of a true World War III with, declarations and troops on the ground from the U.S. has really never been closer, in my opinion. So I think there's a lot of factors at play here. And of course, all of this is very relevant towards the connecting of the Russian and the Middle Eastern fronts. Russia as a player is, regionally, physically connected to both of them. And we're going to get a bit into the Russian strikes in Syria and how it connects to all of this in a second. But yeah, all this stuff in Lebanon with the impending Iranian strike as well is, there's all so much going on that it's hard to piece it all together to make sure we cover everything, because, Hezbollah is obviously going to be escalating at the behest of Iran as well, who are trying to keep the pressure on Israel so that they, aren't able to strike Iran in the most calibrated capacity. And the U.S. is clearly using their threat of the embargo, claiming, of course, it's about aid to Gaza. They're using that as a bargaining chip to make sure Israel's strike is more reserved in nature and not what they want it to be, which is a strike on the nuclear capabilities or a devastating strike on Iran's capability to produce and export oil, or a really, really decapitating strike all across Iran's military capability, so much so to where it would be almost as devastating as taking out their, the oil and the other economic capabilities that keep Iran running despite sanctions and these other things. So it's quite a World War III moment, to say the least. And we're hearing that Bezalel Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are, apparently happy with the decision that Netanyahu has made on the strike, which apparently has been made. So that is not a good sign.
Yeah, of course. I think the shipment of the THAAD missiles, which are similar to the Patriot missiles, but even more long range, these are Lockheed Martin designed high-end American technology, which they're now providing Israel essentially for free. And mind you, each one of these THAAD missile batteries costs well over $1 billion American dollars each. And this is just being given for free to Israel. And the consideration here, Conrad, is that I think it's quite dire, because if we think about it, Israel, once it strikes against Iran, whether it uses its S-35 stealth fighters or some sort of long-range missiles, which Israel does have, or it uses tactical nukes, we're not quite sure how Israel is planning to strike against Iran in the near future, if the green light is given, potentially even before the, during the Biden presidency, even maybe before the 5th of November election, perhaps. then of course Iran will retaliate naturally. And we saw with the Iron Dome could not withstand these long-range, high-end ballistic missiles coming from Iran, even the sort of, I would say, low-grade, they're not Russian-grade hypersonic missiles that Iran does have, but still they do pierce the Iron Dome quite efficiently. And so naturally, the first thing that the US provides Israel in order to defend itself would be these special THAAD batteries. Now, it's really curious because, again, it does point towards the fact that Israel is going to strike first in the near future, most likely very soon, and the expected retaliation from Iran will follow, because if this is a game of chess, at the moment, it's Israel's move. Iran has already retaliated, and it's announced to everyone that this is, I guess, a proper revenge for the death of Nasrallah and for the death of all these various Hezbollah officials and Hamas officials in Lebanon and Palestine, regardless of what we think, if that strike was effective or not. That's exactly what kind of message Iran has sent us. And at the moment, we are awaiting Israel's retaliation. So the THAAD missiles are there to prevent the counterattack by Iran. I think it's very, very obvious and clear. The Iron Dome is not strong enough to withstand whatever's coming from Iran. And mind you, these THAAD missiles, they do strike very high altitude, high atmospheric, like almost up to the firmament level of missiles that Iran might send. And Iran has recently been kind of hinting at the fact that they do possess nuclear weaponry, or at least they're moving towards a technology of that sort. So who knows? Their sort of rhetoric has been incredibly hawkish and militaristic, which we can't really blame them at the moment. These two countries are almost, you can say, officially at war with one another, despite the fact that there are so many people calling for peace in the international community. One of those people, of course, is Biden, who's saying that he's claiming that he has the opportunity to end any attacks between Iran and Israel. At the moment, we're not even sure if Biden is like a living person. It seems like Kamala is doing all the interviews and official press conferences and releases for him. So whether or not these are Biden's real thoughts, or if it's something that his administration cooked up in order to win more votes for Kamala and her campaign, everyone is focusing on the presidential election at the moment, and it looks quite grim for any sort of peace plans between Iran and Israel, I think, in the long term, especially with the US as the middle person. And also, again, Conrad, we recall Russians shipping those S-400 air defense, which are equivalent to the THAAD and the Patriots that the Americans have been giving Israel for a while now. The S-400s, of course, this is, again, a counter move by the US, claiming that, well, if Russia is going to arm Iran, we're going to arm Israel even further, and essentially turn this into a proxy war of sorts between two world superpowers, the Russian Federation and the United States of America. So it is very Cold War-esque, maybe like reminiscent of the Yom Kippur War, when the USSR somewhat assisted the Arab states against Israel, and Israel was, again, bolstered by the Zog Zionist lobby in the United States, when the USSR supported Egypt, Syria, etc. Well, even slightly, not as much as the US, of course, backed Israel. We know that that was a massive overcommitment. Very curious. But I think the most striking and perhaps disturbing, disgusting thing we've seen recently in terms of the genocide against the Palestinians wasn't even the killing of Yahya Sinwar, which is quite, I would say, he died in a very honorable way, right, fighting on the front lines with his people. But the bombing of the makeshift displacement camp in the courtyard of one of the Gaza hospitals. Now, the Al-Aqsa hospital was located right between Gaza City, somewhat in the north of Gaza Strip, and Khan Yunis. So it's literally nowhere near Rafah. It's nowhere near where Yahya Sinwar was even killed. And suddenly Israel simply bombed the tents that were placed outside of the hospital. So these are people waiting, essentially instead of waiting in the emergency room, they're waiting in these makeshift tents, almost like a ghettoized lifestyle at the moment. There's nowhere else to live. There's no real clean water, and they all need urgent, or at least they're waiting for medical care from the hospital, which is overflowing with, unfortunately, people with injuries, people with malnutrition, and of course, majority of them are children. Israel bombed this displacement camp, which caused the fire. All the tents were set on fire. At least 4 people burned to death, and that provided us these horrendous videos that we've seen all online with people literally burning in the tents, and the tents are falling on them, trapping them. And it was almost, as you said, like it is almost like a ritualistic sacrifice of sorts, like to Baal, Moloch, or Astarte or something. It's like horrific footage, and a lot of people, including Orthodox priests, were commenting. They were saying, wait, why is Israel even doing this? Why are they attacking these innocents in a tent? Was this tent camper? Was this a Hamas base of sorts? It was just a tent full of majority of women and children. So absolutely horrific in the Al-Aqsa hospital courtyard. And there's no reason for it. There's no explanation. It's just things just happen. And by analogy, Conrad, I think we can compare, like, when we do pivot to what Russia is doing at the moment in Idlib and northern Syria, the headlines are completely different, right? So if you look at Russia's recent bombardment in the Idlib province, which is 50% of it is controlled by essentially Al-Qaeda derivative militant Wahhabi groups in northern Syria. These are people who are fighting against Assad. These are people who are persecuting Orthodox Christians, who are martyring all kinds of Christians, not just Orthodox, but Catholics, etc., anyone they can find. They're controlling the Idlib province in northern Syria. Russian planes flew a very successful sortie, bombing a few of the key houses which were staging grounds for their operations. And unfortunately, it seems that some civilians were also killed. And the headlines for that bombardment were so rich in this anti-Russian Russophobic language. Wow, the Russian barbarians bombed these poor Syrian people. And allegedly even a child was killed. One child, by the way. One child was killed in this massive bombardment by the Russian Air Force. And, the Russians are breaching Syrian sovereignty and they're attacking innocent Syrians. And then right at the bottom of the article, this is how you know how biased it is. Right at the bottom of the article, it says, well, by the way, 50% of all of Idlib is under essentially Al-Qaeda control, or the derivative of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It's like, well, but you don't see headlines like this appear anywhere in the West about what's taking place with Palestine. Like, of course, now that there are literally probably over 40, 50,000 children killed, you do see people writing, you do see journalists relating, sort of accusing Israel of breaching humanitarian rights and things of that nature, but nothing like Russia bombing a terrorist base in northern Syria. So the hypocrisy is absolutely overwhelming. And I think we see this in every way. And this is why this actually bolsters even shows such as ours, because, well, we try to provide a more or less unbiased opinion on some of these news and try to even compare various conflicts, such as the Ukrainian war at the moment and what's taking place with the genocide in Gaza and Palestine, and even the growing war in Lebanon and Israel, which at the moment Israel is not doing very well in at the moment. The losses, Israel is officially mentioning that they've lost over, close to 40 troops in southern Lebanon. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is claiming hundreds of Israelis have lost their lives, tens of Merkava tanks, which I think is probably the realistic expectation. A lot of these Israeli troops, they're all conscripted, mobilized. They have no training whatsoever. I'm still assuming that the elites of the Israeli armed forces are most likely stationed in Gaza, actually fighting Hamas, not up north, where most of these conscripts were, after months of standing still, essentially in a demoralized state, sent into these southern Lebanese provinces in order to clear out the tunnels. And unsuccessfully so, they only occupy, close to 38 square kilometers at the moment, which is essentially nothing. It's just a few acres, you can say. So very unsuccessful by the Israeli armed forces. And we're on the moving into the third week of the Israeli occupation of Lebanese sovereignty. And the other curious thing, of course, Conrad, is all the news articles about the invasion of Lebanon are all focused on the UNIFIL attack by Israel. Oh, Israel attacked the UN peacekeeping base. How dare they? France, Italy, these majority Catholic countries have suddenly commenced an arms embargo against Israel for the first time. These are like the first countries which have properly embargoed Israel, which no one's really calling them anti-Semitic at the moment. But it does show that the interest of these nations is clearly not for the Lebanese civilians. It's for their own interests in Lebanon, whatever that may be. Is it the Maronite? Is it the Melkite Christians? Not too sure. Is it Pope Francis? Is he pulling strings in order to bolster the Catholic people of Lebanon? And the most dangerous thing, of course, is even because we do know the Lebanese civil war, like tens of thousands of people died in it. It was horrific. Lots of refugees, the neighboring countries. We know what the potential for a Lebanese civil war of a second order can be. And this is what Israel is essentially provoking by causing these clashes between local Christians in southern Lebanon and Shia Sunni Muslim communities, because the Lebanese landscape is very segregated. There are these small towns, villages, and they're all essentially segregated and self-segregated, so to speak. Like there's no real apartheid. It's just people live with their own. And so suddenly conflict arises. You can almost see a second civil war taking place. And this is probably why the United Nations has kept such a large contingency of troops, 10,000, according to official sources, in Lebanon. And it's quite scary because we do know the Talmudic Zog elites, the globalists, so to speak, one of their signature moves in world affairs, and you can see this in Yugoslavia during the Russian Civil War, is to provoke civil conflict amongst a particular nation which they wish to destroy, is to provoke internal infighting and to destroy countries from the inside, which could be one of their projects going into this greater Israel paradigm plan, which they're maybe looking to build in the near future in the coming decades, is to completely destabilize Lebanon. And my guess is these 10,000 UN peacekeepers most likely won't be stopping that. So yeah, it's just very interesting how everyone's concerned about Russia bombing these innocent people in an Al-Qaeda run province, and the poor UN peacekeeping troops. Meanwhile, the Lebanese civilians are essentially under semi-occupation and under constant bombardment by the Israeli IDF. The hypocrisy is completely overwhelming, and the sort of two-faced nature of world media is very evident, I think, to all of us, especially Christians, because we do know who the father of lies is, and Christ, of course, has always called out the hypocrites, and I think we should do the same.
There was a lot of good stuff there. We got to, of course, talk about the different factions and everything going on in Syria, and how I'm actually working on a piece right now that's going to get published in World War Now. The Substack, it's an article about, the lurking clash between Russia and Turkey, how that is, lurking underneath the radar of Russia, Ukraine, of Israel, Palestine, of Israel versus Iran, of even the Caucasus Wars, these other things, how, people aren't talking about it now, but it may even come out of nowhere. But yes, Russia and Turkey will clash, and you can see the deep politics about that, with them clashing through proxies in Syria, them clashing through proxies in Libya, them even with Greece and where they're aligning in the Mediterranean, how that's going to factor into it. So stay tuned. Be sure to subscribe to the Substack to get that in your inbox when it drops. That should be pretty soon. But some of the stuff going on in Lebanon, as you mentioned, is very crazy. You talked about the clashes between Shia and, Melkites specifically. There's stuff going on in eastern Lebanon, even north of Beirut, where supposedly Shias were kidnapping a seminary student of Melkite, and they were claiming he was working for Israel and taking pictures, even though he claimed to just be taking pictures of the moon. And all this was happening, and he was released. And there's, a lot of tension. You, of course, have certain Christian leaders in Lebanon wanting to be armed and completely go along with the Israeli plan to replace Hezbollah south of the Litani River. But then you also have the member of the executive committee of the Christian nationalist Lebanese forces, Antoine Zara. He says, we must salute Yahya Sinwar because he was martyred during fighting and was not assassinated. So I don't know if this is evidence that this guy is more sympathetic to the anti-Israel cause, but again, this is also praising Hamas, who are Sunni, and there's a lot of Sunni leaders as well that are preaching against the Shia and against Hezbollah in Lebanon and wanting to side with the Maronites and Melkites. So maybe this is part of that. He's pro-Sunni. He's not going to say the same thing about Hezbollah that this Lebanese nationalist Christian guy would say. So very interesting things going on in Lebanon. And unfortunately for Hezbollah, it doesn't seem like Iran is necessarily completely on their side in this situation. This is from Mohammad Ghalibaf, the speaker of Iran's Majlis, which is their sort of parliamentary situation they have going on. He's told this to the French outlet Le Figaro. He says Iran is ready to discuss a ceasefire in Lebanon and the implementation of UN Resolution 1701. This would mean only the Lebanese army and UNIFIL would be stationed in South Lebanon, and Hezbollah would withdraw north. So Hezbollah is getting, maybe because Nasrallah is no longer there to use his connections and advocate on their behalf, they are starting to get relegated. But obviously, they're escalating the fighting into Israel and, of course, in the tunnels and taking out, again, you said Israel's claiming 40 dead. There have been strikes by Hezbollah artillery that have taken out more than 40 Israeli soldiers in a single go. So we know that those numbers are obviously untrue, and they wouldn't have only taken 37.5 square kilometers if they weren't taking heavy casualties as they try to push in. So we're never going to get the accurate numbers out of that. But it's interesting that Mohammad Ghalibaf is the one that made this statement that is seemingly anti-Hezbollah, because if you remember, he was that third candidate in the first round of the presidential elections who was also considered a hardliner who got 780,000 votes in that first round and then dropped out. And we all assumed that his votes would then go to Saeed Jalili against Pezeshkian, but Pezeshkian ended up winning handily. But I'm wondering if this guy is, in it with Pezeshkian too. We have always posited that, Iran is playing this very calculated game of back and forth of cat and mouse with Israel, while Israel slowly but surely, and even with perhaps the tacit approval of Iran, dismantles the axis of resistance. They've taken out all of Hamas's leadership. They've taken out all of Hezbollah's leadership. They've even decapitated large swaths of the IRGC. So this could even be part of an internal war in Iran with all of these elected politicians, these more secular people who are perhaps waging a sort of war against, the regime, against the Ayatollah, against the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, and those who are seeking to preserve the spirit of the Islamic Revolution and really be a radical anti-Israel force in the region. Perhaps there is a shadow war in Iran going on there. I mean, we've seen how much Israel was able to influence Hezbollah. We saw that Israel was able to place bombs in IRGC safe houses within Iran. So none of these things are off the table. And I think the fact that Iran is this early in the game talking about agreeing to a ceasefire where Hezbollah withdraws, I don't know, maybe that's their attempt to get Israel not to strike really hard and get Israel to agree to some really anti-Hezbollah measure and then just stop the escalation. Because we know Iran does ultimately not want to escalate, but they've made promises about how strong they will strike back if Israel escalates. And it seems that they're committed to that. So maybe this is just a last attempt to de-escalate things. But again, we will see how Hezbollah-Iranian relations continue, because of course the situation in Syria is important to that, because Syria is how Iran is able to resupply Hezbollah, apparently with lots of Russian weapons. That's another big thing, is that Israel, and this might have to do with Russia's dramatic pivot towards Palestine and Iran in the past few days with their comments from Lavrov and Putin, is because Israel is calling out Russia. They're making a big point. The Israeli military is releasing to Israeli media all these reports about how much Russian hardware the Israeli forces are finding in these Hezbollah tunnels, or finding in these caches, or finding being used by Hezbollah troops, on the front line right now. So perhaps Israel is realizing that Russia knew more and more about how much they were arming Hezbollah than they may have known. And it isn't even just through Iran that all these weapons are coming, which, again, we have thrown doubts on the S-400 ever being given to Hezbollah by Russia, but perhaps some smaller scale things were already going down. But you brought up Syria and all the things going on there. I'm very glad you did. Situation in northwest Syria and the Idlib region is very complex. Like we said, the Russian sorties that they're conducting with the Assad regime, they're striking forces that are being supported by Turkey and the U.S., these forces that are fighting each other. The Turkish-backed forces are being called the joint forces. The U.S.-backed forces are the Levant forces, and these are the remnant forces that used to make up the Syrian National Army, which is one of the main anti-Assad, anti-Syrian Arab army militias that participated in the Syrian civil war, and they are now infighting amongst themselves. At one point, all these groups have been backed by Turkey, and then in some capacity the U.S. as well, but they've kind of split along those lines. And initially it seemed that the Levant forces, the U.S.-backed forces, were being victorious, that they were winning, but then more recently 4 brigades from these forces rejoined the joint forces that were the Turkish-supported ones, and we even saw reports of Turkish border forces on the Syrian-Turkish border firing at the forces that had split and were kind of in rebellion and fighting against Turkey. But Russia and Syria, they used this as an opportunity to bomb both sides. So this is all very interesting stuff regarding Russia and Turkey's, relations, the potential for them to clash through these proxies, and the future overt clash between these groups as the underlying geopolitical struggles that they're engaging in boil to the surface, and it becomes, they become unable to not clash directly because all of their interests are so aligned in the opposite direction. So it's a very interesting development, to say the least. And so as of now, it seems that these U.S. forces have joined with the Turkish forces. So Turkey is consolidating power while the U.S. is actually becoming less powerful in this region of Syria, which again, the U.S. this is the only part outside of eastern Syria where the U.S. has much power. The other parts is just where the U.S. occupies and steals Syria's oil. So that's what's going on there. But, pretty large victory for Russia and Turkey. A lot of the regime allied media is suddenly claiming another kind of attack on civilians, that they were killing children in these attacks and everything. But the Levant forces, the U.S.-backed forces, their media is also reporting on Hezbollah troops being sent into the region to fight against all of these forces on the side of Russia, on the Syrian Arab army and Assad. So I don't know how true that is per se. It would make sense, but at the same time, Hezbollah is very tied up in the south fighting against Israel. So this could just be, again, I mentioned these are the U.S.-backed Levant forces. And this was released before a lot of their brigades defected to the Turkish side after, I think, losing their clashes. And that might have been aided by the Turkish border guards firing upon Levant forces' positions. But it seems that, these U.S.-backed forces are trying to convince everybody that Hezbollah as well is fighting against us in this region, and perhaps trying to get the U.S. to support them more and to get, them dragged into the region and drag Syria more into the conflict, and group Assad in with Hezbollah and have the U.S. fight him on behalf of Israel. So very interesting developments there, to say the least. We're going to be watching it. It's very complex as well. Syria is still a very complex patchwork of militias fighting each other, but it's a very important front that we're going to keep our eyes on. And again, listen to our episode with Syrian Girl, Maram, not the most recent Ether Hour, but the one before that, if you want to hear a bit more about it as well. And I guess before we start talking about the situation with Koreans and some of the other stuff in Ukraine, before we pivot to that direction, Dmitry, I want to get your thoughts on why exactly Putin and Lavrov have made these comments. I mean, Putin specifically has been saying that, the Palestinians will never leave Gaza. They will never leave the West Bank. It's their land. He seems to really be leaning into the support for Palestine. Recently, Palestine requested admittance into BRICS. So we're going to be seeing how that goes. But Putin also said, and Lavrov as well, that it's a big red line for Russia if Israel strikes Iran's nuclear capabilities. So I'm wondering why you think this pivot in rhetoric from the Russians, who very recently, I think it was even less than 2 weeks ago, Lavrov was saying some very pro-Israeli things, really hating on Hamas, hating on, talking about October 7th as this horrible anti-Semitic attack and all this other kind of nonsense. So I'm wondering why you think this pivot has happened and why you think it is such a red line for Israel to strike Iran's nuclear capabilities from perhaps technological perspective as well as just a geopolitical precedent perspective. I'd love to hear thoughts on that as we pivot towards Russia's role in the region and then how this ties into Ukraine and the Far East.
Firstly, Russia's interests in the Iranian nuclear industry are first and foremost like paramount. They are dominant. We know Russia and Iran have very close ties now. They're almost attached at the hip. They understand they have a common enemy in the collective NATO Zog unipolar world. And now that Iran is a member state of BRICS since the 1st of January 2024, that alliance has only deepened. And of course, Russia not only provides the enriched uranium fuel to the 1 or 2 uranium nuclear reactors, which Iran does run, but we know that most likely Russian personnel are actually working in some of these, you can say, top secret Iranian nuclear facilities. And why is that? It's because Russia at the moment, fortunately, is the leader in nuclear uranium technology. Russia enriches 50% of the world's uranium. Enriching uranium, as we'll discuss in detail in the BRICS 8th hour episode, which will come out probably in the next 7 or so days with a new special guest. It's a very long episode, but definitely go check it out. It should come out very soon. Enriching uranium is a very difficult and complex process, and the Russian publicly run corporation Rosatom, which answers almost directly to Putin, it's not a private organization. It enriches 50% of the world's uranium for various countries. And Rosatom, notice, Conrad, despite the 30 or so thousand sanctions placed on Russia, Rosatom is not a sanctioned corporation, despite the fact that it's 100% publicly owned. So its revenue goes straight into the funding of the SMO, but Western powers are not able to sanction Rosatom because it provides enriched uranium literally to Western as well as every other country around the world. And they're constructing almost, you can say, portable miniature nuclear reactors, which is the first. Most nuclear reactors are really giant and complex structures, but Uzbekistan has recently purchased the first miniature nuclear reactor, which it will set up Uzbekistan's a very complex, topographically complex place. And so to actually build a properly sized nuclear reactor is quite difficult, but a miniature, small nuclear reactor placed somewhere in the mountains where it could, of course, provide electricity and energy to nearby towns and villages is, of course, like a first sort of step. And Uzbekistan is very close to Iran. Uzbekistan is, again, unlike Iran, it is a Sunni country and has very close ties with Saudi Arabia. So it's a little bit different geographically and, of course, ideologically speaking, but still that connection between Rosatom, the nuclear industry, and Iran is very close. So that's why if Israel does strike against Iranian nuclear secret bases or whatever Iran is planning and constructing currently on its own territory, which it can do according to its sovereignty, most likely Russian experts, personnel, and engineers will be killed in those strikes. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not just the Iranian experts that are working. There's 100% top-level Russian nuclear scientists who are working, physicists, people of the highest order, who are working in these secret facilities, most likely by contract, and also to deepen and strengthen ties between these two countries. And this is not some illegal activity. This is normal. Countries should be cooperating, especially in the fields of these higher-end technologies, because why would we want Iran to commit mistakes with such delicate materials, such as enriched uranium like this? This can cause mass pollution, death, kill innocent people. Rather invite Russian experts who have worked with this very complex mineral and actually do it right. So I think that's one consideration.
Well, yeah, that's why Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, he explicitly said, "We have repeatedly warned and continue to warn and caution Israel against even hypothetically considering the possibility of an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities and nuclear infrastructure." And, they're really leaning on the nuclear safety and nuclear, non-proliferation actually in the midst of all of this stuff. And perhaps there's even a hint at we know you have, nuclear weapons as well, Israel. So let's not get too cocky here. Sorry, you can continue.
Oh, no, 100%. And the other, I think, consideration why this sudden pivot, hopefully the pivot will continue. Hopefully it's a proper 90 or 180 degree turn away from the schizophrenia that was, well, we're going to take a middle stance between Palestine and Israel. Being pro-Israeli does not benefit Russia at all. There are zero benefits, including, of course, not being aligned with the Talmudic elites, which are currently taking certain positions of authority in Russia as well. Simply moving away from that heritage, I think, is very, very obviously clearly beneficial to Russia in the long term and the short term. But Israel recently, this week, actually struck one of the major Syrian ports in Latakia, which is located, of course, Syria does have major Mediterranean ports, one of which Russia is currently renting, essentially leasing from Syria, which is why the Assad-Putin relationship is so strong. But Latakia is mostly a Syrian port, and apparently they had a weapons depot, which Israel sent planes across the Mediterranean Sea, bombed Latakia, this weapons depot, caused massive explosions, did not comment on it at all. In fact, the United Kingdom some British ships actually announced that Israel officially bombed this Latakian port, killing probably tens of people in the explosion. And this, of course, took place as most Israel bombardments, similar to the one near the Al-Aqsa hospital. Israel likes to fly its planes and bomb targets at night. So this occurred around 11:50 p.m., so almost at midnight on Wednesday. And so the really bizarre thing is that Latakia is located right next to the Russian Khmeimim base, which is a major air base in Syria. I think it's one of the largest Russian air bases. And Israeli planes almost hit it again in what seems to be a tactical sortie against the IRGC and the Syrian-aligned Iranian allies, or whatever it claimed that this was. But ever since October the 7th, statistics, and this is reported by Al Jazeera, so it's like a Qatar sort of, you can say somewhat neutral, but we know they're pro-Hamas, anti-Israeli. But they've reported Israel has struck Syria since October 7th, so over a year now, 12 months, 220 times. So 220 bombing raids and attacks by Israel on Syrian soil. Just consider that. And for those of you saying, well, let's just all go for peace and let's not have a war commence. I mean, this is a war. If a country bombs you 220 times in 12 months, that's officially, I think that's a war. There is a war between Syria and Israel, officially. The only question is, on which grounds will there be a peace treaty signed or an armistice, or who will put down their arms first, or even surrender? Who will sign, who will capitulate, right? And obviously Syria and Assad are not interested in capitulating because they have Russia's support. They also don't wish to give up their sovereignty like the Palestinians did at one point during the first Intifada. We know what that turned into, the literal genocide, which is still taking place now. Northern Gaza, it's being occupied. Now that all the northern Gazans have been moved south, the Israeli settlers, we know those hardcore Zionists and even Talmudically minded Kabbalists, we know what they do when they settle a particular territory. There's going to be ethnic, cultural cleansing. The Palestinians will never get their land back. And this is curious because Putin specifically said the Palestinians are not going to leave their land. Again, perhaps this is evident of the fact that, well, there was potentially an Israeli plan of moving all of the Gaza Palestinians, the 2 or so million of them, into these massive refugee camps, which Egypt was constructing on the Sinai Peninsula. But Putin clearly has stated that he's against that sort of thing. And this is a really strong statement. We know that Putin has been a bit on the fence over the last 12 months, but such a sort of cementing statement, I think, is a good point from which even future Russian journalists and spokespersons can push off from. We don't have to say that Putin is pro-Israeli anymore, because clearly this is an anti-Zog statement officially. And in fact, this is also a counterbalance and a counterweight, almost rhetorically a rebuttal to the fact that President Trump has taken a very strong pro-Israeli position, he's almost more pro-Israeli now than he has been in 2016. And we're not going to discuss Trump too much. Of the elections coming up, we'll have plenty of time to do that. But notice Putin is taking the opposite position because he understands American and Russian interests, unfortunately. And by American, I mean the interests of the deep state, the Pentagon, the American swamp, are directly contrary and opposite. They are not analogous. They do not align on what should be taking place in the Middle East. Very interesting. So Russian interests at the moment are at risk in the Middle East. Essentially, Russian cooperation with both Syria and Iran is placed at risk by Israel and the US. So Lavrov and Putin need to hold strong. They need to maneuver this geopolitical ship and actually not crash it against the rocks. And they need to throw away this schizophrenic idea that just because certain Russian bureaucrats, officials, celebrities have roots that go back to the Pale of Settlement or Israeli, or they have like a rabbinical ancestor, that's for some reason Russia needs to align itself with Israel politically. That's not the case. They need to really shift away from that sort of thinking, because in the long term, there will be no benefit in Russia being pro-Jewish and pro-Israeli at all. And this is a point which I think we can debate with anyone. And historically, that's been very clear. These particular people have not contributed much to Russian history in terms of positivity. And in fact, mostly it's been a great benefit that most of them have moved away from Russian territory historically. And mind you, now that we look at Ukraine, we'll speak about Zelensky in a minute. We do know who Zelensky's handlers are. We know who Andrei Yermak is. Andrei Yermak literally travels to all these rabbinical congresses in the United States, meets with the leaders of B'nai Brit, that Freemasonic Talmudic Jewish organization. Andrei Yermak is literally the right-hand man of Zelensky, someone who no blood and dirt sticks to him. These are these secretive spirit love type characters, these top level Bolsheviks who run Ukraine at the moment, who don't even make the news. We mention these people because they stand in the shadows and they control clown figures such as Zelensky, and they have ties to very deep, very dark organizations that span across centuries. So it's quite scary what's taking place in Ukraine now. So hopes and prayers with Russia. And definitely, if you guys want to know more about Russia and Syria, for Syria and Lebanon, our episode with a Syrian girl is excellent on that, the 8th hour, and the recent 8th hour that came out of Andrei Afanasyev, of course, covering the Russian crisis as well. And his opinions on Israel are very powerful, given that he's traveled to Israel several times as a pilgrim, an Orthodox Christian pilgrim. And some of his comments on Israel are very apt, and they really paint a picture of someone who just wants to be there for the Christian experience and yet is still disrespected simply for his religion, which explains why certainly Christians are being targeted in Lebanon at the moment.
Yeah, we're going to get to Ukraine specifically and talk about some of the nonsense coming from Zelensky. But of course, the brief other situations going on in the Middle East, we have something going on in the Saudi sphere. This is happening as we speak. Pretty much the MBC Group, which is a big Saudi-owned media corporation. They have headquarters in Baghdad in Iraq. They recently were publishing footage and stories about the death of Yahya Sinwar and all these other resistance leaders, calling them terrorists. And immediately, Shia resistance groups in Iraq mobilized, and they've now stormed the offices of this media organization. And again, we've seen Saudi Arabia claim to Iran that they are going to not allow Israel to use its airspace for their attack, but you get things like this where Saudi media groups are consistently organizing against the resistance. The same thing with the UAE. You have everything going on there with the UAE-backed Southern Transition Council obviously being one of the main forces against the Houthis. We have the UAE backing the Rapid Support Forces against pretty much everybody else who supports Palestine in Sudan. So it's unfortunate that the Hijaz and these Gulf states are very much not united in their support for Palestine, as many might guess. Even, again, it's the Persian and Turkish worlds that seem more united against Israel than any of these Arab states, despite the fact that the Palestinians themselves are Arabs and are Sunnis. So it's a very unfortunate reality that we're seeing there. But regarding Russia as well, the 3+3 meeting has begun in Istanbul, which is a group that consists of Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. But apparently Georgia has withdrawn from this group, which I find a bit interesting. But the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan is escalating to the point where most Armenians are talking about, signing a peace treaty with Azerbaijan and ceding all of, all the contentions and all the issues. And I think perhaps, I don't know what Pashinyan and Putin talked about in their meeting, but we know that Russia has very much been siding with Azerbaijan. We know that in many ways that is the connection with Russia and Israel, is this Azerbaijani connection in Kazakhstan, where Russia is processing and refining Azerbaijani and Kazakhstan crude oil and sending it to Israel literally to support their war efforts. So I'm wondering if any of that disruption has something to do with the pivot. You mentioned, of course, all of the economic motivations regarding Iran's nuclear facilities and their capabilities, and that could have been why, that supersedes the relationship with Azerbaijan, connecting them to Israel. So that could be a reason behind the pivot, perhaps. I'm not an expert on these things, but we know a lot of these things are connected in that regard. But, I think one thing we have to then, the big interesting story that people, I guess, are talking about as we speak regarding the pivot towards the front in Ukraine is this news about North Korean troops. South Korean intelligence agencies are reporting that 12,000 North Korean troops have been pledged to fight in Ukraine. We have seen footage that, as far as I'm aware, is legitimate, that does show about 1,500 North Korean troops registering and preparing for training in Russia itself, in Siberia and the Far East, which, again, as far as I'm aware, that could have been going on for longer. I don't know if this is even breaking or if they're just deciding to reveal this to us. But in some capacity, we know that Russia and North Korea have a lot of bilateral treaties, some regarding defense. Some people say that, not even publicly, that there are just complete mutual defense treaties, to the point where North Korea is being activated due to the Kursk situation, because they have an agreement with Russia that if Russian territory is invaded, they have to defend them. I don't know exactly, but the Ukrainians are really leaning into this, obviously, because North Korea is viewed as a worldwide villain. So if they're on the side of Russia, they want to use that against Russia for PR purposes. So I guess I'm wondering your thoughts on the situation in Ukraine, and if you think North Korean soldiers are about to be on the ground on the front line in Donbass or in Kursk or Zaporozhye imminently.
No, absolutely. I mean, last week, I think we accurately reported that there were actually already Korean engineers, military specialists operating the KN-23 North Korean ballistic missiles in the Donbass on Russian territory. So that's Kirill Budanov, the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, right? Essentially the Ukrainian GRU, head of the Ukrainian terrorist department, basically, you can say, because all that Ukraine specializes in primarily is, of course, these terroristic acts on Russian soil, as we've seen the assassination of various Russian Orthodox Christians essentially over the last 2 years. That's what Ukrainian intelligence is, of course, capable of, like as we've seen. Those are the fruits of Ukrainian spycraft, right? It's typically assassination and terrorist strikes. But who exactly leaked this knowledge that North Korean troops will be traveling from Pyongyang, from North Korea, first to eastern Siberia, and then, of course, to the front lines? Most likely the CIA. I don't think the SBU, I don't think Kirill Budanov had this sort of information simply handed to him by his personnel. This must have been American intelligence, which we know are very capable. There's definitely American spies all over Russia working their hardest in order to obtain this top-level military intelligence for the United States, or even we can even say officially South Korean spies most likely in North Korea reported that there are North Korean troops. I'm personally leaning into the fact that because Kirill Budanov officially made this statement, and he said that by the 1st of November, which is in about 2 weeks, there'll be 10 to 11,000 North Korean troops in Russia that will be ready to fight Ukraine. So these are infantrymen, primarily men who will be fighting on the front lines. 10,000 is not a small number. This is roughly a third of what Ukraine sent to invade the Kursk Oblast recently, which fortunately enough, at this point this week, Conrad, good news, Russia is officially, according to General Abdialodinov, essentially one of the leading Chechen generals who's currently reporting quite diligently on the Ukrainian essentially terrorist operation in Kursk. He's reported that Ukraine has lost 50% of the territories which it has occupied since the Kursk operation commenced. So quite good by the Russians. And if you look at certain maps, most of them appear that Russia is potentially going to close a very amazing cauldron in the Kursk. We don't know. Like Russia has not closed many cauldrons over this conflict, unfortunately. This is not World War II. So if Russia can somehow entrap at least 10,000 Ukrainian troops in Kursk, force them to surrender, it will be a major victory, one of the biggest military W's you can say over the entire 2.5 year span, probably equivalent to the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive in July of 2023. But let's just speak about the pros and the cons. What's the point of having North Koreans fight for Russia here? Well, on one hand, it builds that bilateral relationship between North Korea and Russia, to some of the most sanctioned states by the Western unipolar world, right? So these states are natural allies at this point. North Korea appears to be somewhat of a monarchy, which is quite based. They don't believe in liberal democratic values, which is quite powerful, and Russia needs to adopt that sort of position as well. So we completely agree with that stance. North Korea has also essentially molded its Marxism and turned it into a sort of localized Judaism, a form of essentially North Korean nationalism. So it's not even Leninist in its sort of original sense. It's communism and Marxism has morphed over time and become more pro-Korean, you can say. Yes, Korean people suffer from generally not having the same access to resources and, let's just say, nutritional needs. Like this is evident in even the difference between height of South Koreans and North Koreans. But Russia could potentially alleviate this in the future by superseding and overcoming most of the sanctions, building closer ties with North Korea. And this starts with actually operations such as this. North Korea receives a lot more benefit from Russia than Russia does from North Korea. So North Korea needs to prove itself by assisting Russia, sending a detachment and, or you can say almost 2 battalions worth of North Korean troops to Russia. On one hand, North Korea earns Russia's trust in good faith. On the other hand, North Korean troops receive one thing which has the Russian-Ukrainian war has shown to be extremely valuable, Conrad, and that is military experience. We know that's worth one military experienced soldier as an infantryman is worth 5 or 10 unexperienced soldiers. We know just the hesitation, the inability to use combat equipment efficiently, even not pulling the trigger, things like that, even PTSD-prone mental disorders, things like that. An experienced soldier, someone who's battle-hardened, is worth his weight in gold during this military conflict. That's why most of the veterans of the Donbass since 2014 have been the best and the most experienced soldiers in Wagner, as well as some of the best Russian contingents in the conflict. And North Korea has not had any hot war. Like most of these soldiers have grown up in this armistice type situation between North and South Korea. So if a war eventually does break out between North and South Korea, which there are certain leanings towards that, given that you notice all the major roads between North and South Korea being blown up purposefully by the North Korean by the North Korean armed forces? Will this be a potential future Eastern Front that opens up when China attempts to liberate Taiwan, at the same time takes over some of these shoals, which Philippines currently occupies in the South China Sea? And again, China's close ally, North Korea, begins some sort of deterrent strikes against the South Korean neighbor, potentially. Like, this could be one massive operation that takes place in the Pacific and in East Asia. Very, very likely, if the Third World War does escalate to that particular extent, which we think it will most likely next year in 2025. But these North Korean soldiers, like, consider the fact that Ukraine has already, like, the best Ukrainian commandos and troops. These are men well over the ages of 40, have actually received, when they were young, they actually received military training by US NATO officials, and US NATO, they participate in US NATO operations and so-called peacekeeping in Iraq, Afghanistan. We know that there were thousands of Ukrainians rotated through some of these Middle Eastern conflicts in the early 2000s. And then where did they go? No, they returned back home to Ukraine. And this is what made up that 5 to 10,000, perhaps even more, solidifying troop that Ukraine had. I think Zelensky as well as Syrski spoke about this very clearly, that Ukraine actually had armed, trained veterans who it could rely upon to actually improve and to, maybe even for propaganda purposes, bolster the spirit of the Ukrainian armed forces. So we can't look at Ukraine as just an entire army of unfortunately lynched and kidnapped conscripts. They do have a potential core. Maybe a lot of them are in the Azov battalion of very trained and experienced troops. And maybe this is what North Korea is trying to gain by sending these 10,000, 11,000 soldiers to the Donbass. Again, mind you, these news are not confirmed by North Korea nor Russia at the moment. So we are kind of depending on this Western media sources, and this could be fear-mongering. Kirill Budanov, given that he's literally the head of Ukrainian intelligence, could be lying to us. But even if he's not lying, this isn't a bad thing, the fact that Russia will be providing North Korea with an opportunity to assist it in this current conflict. And also it wins, you can say, PR, presidential, political points for Vladimir Putin and United Russia. Russia will not need to, well, at least anytime soon. It seems that Russia really doesn't want to commence a second mobilization, which I personally believe a second mobilization is most likely required in order to secure victory in the SMO. But it seems the Russian elites are really against any form of second mobilization in order not to lose, shall we say, the votes during any upcoming elections, even local parliamentary ones into the Duma, which is unfortunate that electoral politics supersedes national interests on the security front, on the front lines. But in any case, North Koreans will be helping Russia, hopefully, in the near future, as Kirill Budanov said on the 1st of November. So this is amazing news. And I think it somewhat aligns with the destruction of the roads and major communication pathways between North and South Korea, which on one hand, that's scary. On the other hand, we do know South Korea at the moment, it's a major opponent of Russia and even, you can say, Christianity. It promotes Ukrainian Zelenskyism. It promotes anti-Christian values amongst its own people. The degeneracy in South Korea cannot be overstated, right? This entire country is essentially a Masonic super project in East Asia. How liberal and how degenerate can we turn a country by sort of drowning it in so-called deep state American values? And unfortunately, it's really showing at the moment. And of course, the creation of the false dialectic between North and South Korea, completely unhealthy and anti-Korean, you can say, generally. So my view, Conrad, is that the North Korean shipment of troops, I know they're training in Vladivostok somewhere in the east, but if they are sending 10,000 or so, it's probably going to be beneficial both for Russia and North Korea. It's kind of I know it's quite scary for Kirill Budanov, but for us, I think it's good news.
Yeah, perhaps the North Koreans are securing their border because they fear a strong retaliation because of the reality that they are openly supporting the Russians in a way that, I mean, again, we know that no other country has supplied weapons to Ukraine like the US and the UK have towards Russia. There's no comparable situation. So in my opinion, North Korea supplying a few thousand troops isn't actually as on the level of the support, but of course it's a different type of support. It's literal people on the ground. It shows a different level of commitment, frankly. Americans would not tolerate right now, actual Americans being sent, active duty soldiers being sent to die. But in North Korea, I guess the people there, who knows if they'll even be made aware of it, but if they are, I think they could easily be convinced, if they don't already believe, that it would be for a good cause. So I think there's, like I mentioned before, it's a lot lower stakes for Kim Jong-un. But Zelensky himself at this point, I was comparing in my head the two conflicts ongoing, Israel and Palestine, and then the Russia-Ukraine situation, because we know that we've talked about from a prophetic perspective, it's a worse reality to come if the situation escalates actually in Russia and Ukraine, as opposed to escalating between Israel and Iran. Not that either escalating, of course, is good. We want peace in all of these regions. But unfortunately, as we have posited for the past few years and have unfortunately been vindicated again and again, things will not be going down, or things will not be cooling down, rather, but fronts will continue to pop up, and the fronts that do exist will continue to heat up. And that is exactly what we have observed over the past 2 years of doing this show. And meanwhile, as Netanyahu says that the Gaza war is nearing its end with the death of Yahya Sinwar, which is basically just code for we can now fully focus on the war in Lebanon and the impending strikes on Iran and even potential fronts into Syria from our occupied Golan Heights and these sorts of things. You have Zelensky, on the other hand, who is pitching his new victory plan to everybody that will listen, and that involves an invitation to join NATO, far more weapons and no restrictions on their use, and more non-nuclear deterrence, as well as a whole bunch of other post-war promises and everything. And that NATO membership combined with the non-nuclear deterrence is basically a sort of threat where Zelensky is saying, if you don't give us the NATO membership, we're going to start pursuing a sort of nuclear weapon, which, again, I don't know if he's taking some kind of playbook from Iran or from Israel, or we're just getting desperate, but it seems to me like Zelensky is trying to provoke Western-backed negotiations where through the back channels that they have with Russia, they kind of goad Russia into these negotiations. Because Zelensky doesn't want to say it himself. He's not going to come out in a speech and say, we are willing to give up Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. Like, he just can't do that. He'd get killed. It just wouldn't work. I think the West wouldn't even want him to do that. It would be a media disaster. So I think he wants the West to goad Russia into negotiations behind the scenes. And then after, some long drawn out, really tense photographs of him, with a bulging forehead and stressing out, they can cede some territory. But as of right now, I don't think Russia is necessarily interested in that. And, maybe Russia will become more interested in that if they're forced to redeploy, more focus to the Middle East and spend a lot more time dealing with that. But again, with these North Korean troops, it seems that Russia is very much prepared to take this well into 2025 and take more and more territory. And as we've said before, we do believe that still includes Odessa, Nikolaev, these places, as well as a lot more territory east of the Dnieper River. So the map is going to continue to change, and be sure to listen to the episode with Andrei Afanasyev. We talk about all of that, as well as a host of other issues, future czars in Russia, successors to Putin and Lukashenko, the reality of the front lines, of course, in Kursk and in Donbass and in all the places where Russia is advancing. And if you have any other updates about Russia currently advancing towards after Chasiv Yar and some of these other places, as well as I know that there were certain retreats a while back in Kherson and Zaporozhye, because again, the focus is so much in Donetsk right now. If you have any other updates there, we also need to talk about what's going on in Africa.
No, absolutely. Just briefly on Russia, the success continues, right, in the Donetsk Oblast, Toretsk, which is Chasiv Yar, unfortunately, as you mentioned. Chasiv Yar is still a stalemate. Russia is winning, but however, Ukrainians have really entrenched themselves and Russians are really taking their time there. But Toretsk is a lot more important, and Russia has apparently already captured 66.6, two-thirds of Toretsk is in Russian hands, which is roughly, more than what it had last week. So every week, of course, the Russian advance continues to push. And as reported by our good friends on the front lines, actually, the morale of the troops in the Donetsk Oblast and the people serving in the SMO is actually up, right? The Russian troops are not demoralized, despite the fact that the war and the SMO has been ongoing for 2.5 years now. In fact, the recent advancements and the progress of the Russian troops in this particular oblast, the most long-suffering, the Donetsk, which has seen war for the last 10 years, is actually on the up, and people are feeling a lot better about themselves. The soldiers, the locals, they're seeing a potential future liberation of the entire Donetsk Oblast from the Ukrainians, which again, it's interesting that you mentioned Zelensky's Keir Starmer sort of discussion, the peace plan, where he's openly stated he's not willing to give up an inch of Ukraine to Russia in order to secure peace, which is absolutely insane. It just shows that Zelensky's mindset is determined to kill as many Ukrainians as possible, and he's playing a certain role in this particular mission. Like, he does not actually want a practical peace plan. He's for continuing the conflict because, again, there's material gain in for it. There are all kinds of benefits for him and his elites, apparently, and those who stand behind him. So there's a certain really dark agenda ongoing. And when we discuss, of course, the church persecution, you can kind of see perhaps details and glimpses of that agenda in its most disgusting forms. But kind of moving over to the Horn of Africa, I think there's some very interesting developments ongoing. It appears that Sudan and Egypt have definitely united in their common interest to face against Ethiopia. In fact, Ethiopia and Eritrea are trying to normalize relations, which is quite interesting. Eritrea and Ethiopia have had long-standing conflicts over access to the Red Sea. If you look at a map, Eritrea, of course, naturally prevents Ethiopia from having access to that major waterway, which leads to the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean and connects to the Indian Ocean. It's just absolutely, it's somewhat amusing that a map that, this particular land, the nation state of Eritrea was even formed in the first place, right? It really shows you somewhat how unfair geopolitics can be on a nation state which is weakened, such as Ethiopia was at the time when Eritrea was formed. But at the moment, we do see tensions rise in Egypt in particular. Very strong anti-Ethiopian rhetoric, politically speaking, is on the rise. And this is very strange, Conrad, given the fact that as of the 1st of January this year, both Ethiopia and Egypt have joined BRICS. So these are two member states with the 9 members of BRICS, and at the moment they're at odds in terms of their geostrategic interests. Ethiopia is still not strong enough, I believe, to face off against Egypt in a one-on-one collision, considering the fact that there are still skirmishes and conflicts in the northwestern and northeastern territories of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a very complex, linguistically, culturally, and religiously diverse place, and they've had trouble with Islamic terrorism in the past. Egypt at the moment is a very Western-aligned country, which again is also aligned closely with Israel. And it's just looking like Ethiopia potentially could be facing isolation from multiple fronts, Conrad, as we mentioned. Somaliland, right? Support for Somaliland and access to the Red Sea. That project is being looked upon very grimly by Somalia, which is the country next door. Somalia is supported by both Egypt militarily and Turkey. So these are two, again, Western-aligned countries. Somewhat Turkey is, of course, the major member of NATO. And at the same time, we have, if you listen to some of the lectures and interviews of Eric Prince, he's actually saying that the UAE is supporting Somalia as well. They're training, the UAE and Somalia are both jointly training their navies in anti-piracy operations. So we know Eric Prince, as you mentioned, kind of before we started recording, this is a very zogged out, interesting, mysterious character in US politics in general, the head of Blackwater, a very sort of deep state aligned actor who now claims to be somewhat independent, but he's based in the UAE. And we know the UAE is one of the most pro-Israeli, Sunni dominant sort of city nation states amongst the Arab Gulf states. So very interesting connection there. It's looking really tough for Ethiopia because, again, the ball is in its court. Ethiopia is being pressured from both sides, both from the northwest as well as the southeast. And geographically, it does need to align itself a lot closer with the BRICS nations. And there might be an opportunity for that this week, Conrad, on the 22nd of October at the BRICS summit in Kazan, where perhaps Ethiopian officials could speak to Egyptian officials in person. We have to understand BRICS is primarily a networking forum economically, and where these countries who have mutually beneficial interests can actually interact and relate to one another. So potentially, maybe those conflicts on the Horn of Africa could be alleviated by simply high-level diplomatic talks, behind closed doors in Kazan in central Russia. So fingers crossed, Ethiopia can sort out its relations with Egypt and Sudan very soon, because we know that Israel, I think, would be very glad to pull the attention of the world away from Palestine and what it's doing in Syria and Lebanon if a new conflict would arise on the Horn of Africa, which would lead to probably tens of thousands of deaths and all kinds of humanitarian crises again. And then it would, of course, absolve itself of all its various crimes that it's committing in the Levant. So I think that's the primary consideration of anti-Ethiopian unipolar geostrategic interests at the moment.
Well, frankly, the region, the Horn of Africa and, the far southern Arabian Peninsula, where those two regions connect is everybody's looking at Taiwan and the Koreas as sort of the next third front. Really, this is the kind of the third region of World War III that it's not quite as organized of a conflict. The specific powers that are at war are next to each other in the region as of yet, but that could change very soon. We have US B-2 bombers being used on the Houthis over Yemen, just right across the Bab el-Mandeb Straits there. And that's, of course, being perceived as a warning towards Iran that if we're willing to go this far for your little proxy down here, think about what we can do to you. And the situation in Ethiopia is looking, it's not going too great for Ethiopia. They did recently renew their lease and agreements with Djibouti, which is good, despite Djibouti apparently getting a lot of pressure to side with everybody else in the region who are siding against Ethiopia. And we heard recently from the Egyptian foreign minister You mentioned the UAE and Egypt, how they are working together in Somalia, despite the fact that they are working against each other in Sudan because the UAE is supporting the Rapid Support Forces, whereas Egypt is supporting the Sudanese government there alongside Russia and others. So very interesting developments. But the Egyptian foreign minister, regarding the Somaliland situation, he said Egypt is committed to helping Somalia restore territorial integrity and central government control over all of its territories. So that would mean a military campaign into Somaliland, which is autonomous and acts on its own and is frankly much safer than the rest of Somalia. And Ethiopia has recognized them, so they would have a duty to defend them in some capacity. So Egypt is basically saying they're willing to go to war with Ethiopia in, the northwestern regions of Somalia, right there on the Horn of Africa. And this comes amidst the presidents of Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia formalizing and deepening an anti-Ethiopian alliance. This was during a trilateral summit on October 10th. Somalia has worked to deepen diplomatic relations and security cooperation with Eritrea and Egypt since Ethiopia signed a naval port deal with Somaliland in January 2024. Egypt and Eritrea have also have long-standing concerns with Ethiopia, and the summit with Somalia is an opportunity for Egypt and Eritrea to address these concerns. The summit is likely part of the framework that Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia are developing to counter Ethiopia if it follows through on its port deal with Somaliland. The three countries seek to legitimize their alliance against Ethiopia and build up Somalia's military in the short term. Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia aim to align their policies in the long term, which will likely include policies on Ethiopia. The countries agreed to establish a trilateral joint committee with the foreign ministers from each country to oversee and advance strategic cooperation across all areas. So, again, this landlocked population powerhouse, Christian powerhouse of Ethiopia, is being ganged up on by everybody else in the region. And I do wonder how Ethiopia's relations with Russia will be able to factor into this, because there is always the temptation for them to side with the West, perhaps. But we will see where Ethiopia decides to take this. But they are, of course, still, as Dimitri mentioned, being plagued with the remnants of a civil war as well. So it's not the easiest situation there, in that very demographically, religiously, and in many ways, geographically diverse as well. It's a very complicated region. But we heard Putin also talking about how there's no BRICS currency in the works, which a lot of, as I call them, BRICS tards or multipolar heads had been saying that any day now the BRICS currency is going to be coming out. It's going to be a gold-backed based Bitcoin central digital currency from the BRICS people. It's like, yeah, obviously that was all a lot of fantasy. And Putin says, yeah, nobody's really thinking about that right now. However, he did confirm that 95% of Russian, trade is done in other national currencies with other partners and whatnot, which is a powerful testament to the Russian economy. But unless you have anything else to say about the situation in Africa or any of these other situations across the wide variety of fronts that we've discussed already, we do need to talk about the persecution in the church. I know that there is a bill in Poland going forward about gay civil unions, so the based Poland memes may be on the out. I didn't know where else to stick that into the show, so we're mentioning it here. But unless you have anything else to comment on these other fronts that we've just discussed, we probably need to talk about the church in Ukraine, because a lot of people probably saw the very dramatic video that went viral of parishioners, including bishops and priests and monks, being assaulted and stormed in on by armed men, and then the parishioners fought back and threw benches and things that these people may have known the video we're talking about. We posted it on the World War Now X and Twitter accounts and on other places. But unless you have any other updates on the fronts, Dimitri, we can discuss that.
Yeah, just wanted to mention, Poland, I guess it is a front on the European spectrum in terms of it is a very strongly Catholic country, the homeland of the recently most popular Pope, right, John Paul II, who's the Polish Pope. And people view Poland as this hopeful entity, like a heartland of Europe, somewhere where a European conservatism can be reborn, and again, which can spread to its neighbors. But unfortunately, its elites, similar to the elites of Greece, which is a very strongly Orthodox Christian country, 90% plus of Greek people are at least baptized, or they identify as Orthodox Christians. We won't really go into like denominalism and how often they attend church, etc. But Poland is a very strongly Roman Catholic country, and still we see Donald Tusk, the president of Poland, very strongly support essentially same-sex unions, all this ridiculous LGBTQ nonsense. And we'll see if this gets shut down, similar to the abortion bill, which was attemptedly passed in July, August of this year. And again, Polish conservatives walked the streets and they managed to prevent it from taking place, right? So again, there's a lot of pressure on the Polish conservative Catholic community to actually stand up for its rights. And I'm 100% sure that the Orthodox Christian community, we know the Polish Orthodox Church, it's quite small, but it is growing over time. It's bigger than some other churches in Central and Western Europe. It's well developed. The Polish identity, Polish people being Slavic, again, they're kind of reinforced by their sort of proximity to Eastern Orthodoxy. They do approve of it a lot more than maybe people of other ethnicities around Europe, and their appreciation of it has only grown. The Polish Orthodox Church has been growing, and we know that their position on these degenerate acts will always be strongly against the current elites. And so I think that's most likely what's happening in Poland. It's going to cause massive protests, and hopefully the conservative wings of Polish politicians actually win out and stop this nonsense from taking place, because Russia does need more conservative allies and more Christian, more, I suppose, based Christian-aligned allies in Europe. Because again, in order to face this cultural degeneration, there needs to be more examples than just an Orthodox Christian Russia. I think other nations such as Greece really need to pick up their game and begin providing other examples of right-wing development in the world. But, generally speaking, the church persecution, I think, in Ukraine can be highlighted by probably one of the most disturbing videos we've seen in a while. There's been a couple of videos filmed by the parishioners and some of the people assaulting the Cathedral of Archangel Michael in the Cherkasy diocese. If you recall, the listeners, last week we covered the fact that the Archangel Michael Cathedral, the Ukrainian Banderites attempted to capture the cathedral at nighttime, but Metropolitan Theodosius caught wind of it and announced on social media that all of his parishioners arrive at this cathedral at night and sort of block the path of any of these Banderite, neo-Nazi, or weird Talmudic characters from entering the church and to taking the relics and the anti-mints and all the other really holy and sacred objects within the church, right? Essentially robbing it. So that was last week. This week, escalation has taken place. The cathedral was actually raided on two occasions. Once during the day, the impact was, of course, tremendous. It was more than 100 people. So remember, we reported on those Banderite characters last week who essentially were planning to create these anti-Christian, anti-Orthodox militias to raid these cathedrals across all of Ukraine, across all of its various provinces and oblasts. This seems to be one of those projects, because exactly 100 Ukrainian Banderites entered into this cathedral. They began robbing it. They stole several relics, church utensils, chalices, things like that. Some of the spoons used during the communion, crosses, food, clothing, vestments. And we know these vestments, mind you, a lot of these vestments, they're worth thousands of dollars in American value. They're not made in China. Typically, they're woven and created in Eastern Europe, and people donate. These are all donated things that parishioners have given these church communities and cathedrals over years. Church books were stolen, computer equipment, documents, and almost 2,000 American dollars in money, which was at the front of in the narthex of the cathedral. It was actually placed in these donation boxes. The actual donation boxes were stolen as well. So it's literal thievery taking place in the Archangel Michael Cathedral. Eventually, unfortunately, despite the fact that Metropolitan Theodosius was there present during this raid, as well as many priests, monks, monastics, clergymen, subdeacons, they physically tried to push the 100 or so Banderites out of the cathedral. They did not manage to secure the cathedral for themselves. And unfortunately, everything, I believe, except the anti-mints, was almost stolen. The cathedral is now officially under a Ukrainian governmental occupation. And we need to emphasize that this is not a random bandit raid or a bunch of street hooligans. These are people sanctioned by the Ukrainian government state who are officially raiding an Orthodox Christian cathedral, persecuting it, similar to what the Bolsheviks were doing in the early 20th century, or what the ancient Roman pagans were doing across the Mediterranean world, raiding and destroying the early Christian churches. It's quite disgusting footage. And I think it's very striking that they chose the particular diocese of Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, who you can't even compare him to even Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, who has very clear, somewhat pro-Russian stances and who's made, pro-unity stances between Russia and Ukraine, or other metropolitans of the Ukrainian church. Metropolitan Theodosius was very, I would say, conservative in that he was always, I guess, neutral, and he never spoke out against Zelensky, never spoke out against the Ukrainian state. The only thing that he spoke out against was open persecution and pressure and harassment of Orthodox Christians. And still, someone that moderate, his cathedral in his diocese is raided. And this is not some western province near Lvov or some very faraway province. This is Cherkasy, which is located in literally central Ukraine next to Kiev. So that's how bad it, and there was no police called, no official support from any, it's very fortunate that the armed 100 gangsters who took over the cathedral were not armed, not armed with pistols, or they didn't use any firearms, because a lot of parishioners could have been hurt, but they did use tear gas, batons, baseball bats, things like that. The footage is quite striking. So it's just very unfortunate that persecution is taking such a overt phase. It's really entering into that, well, now we're going to have gangs of 100 or so essentially radicalized neo-Bolsheviks taking over every single cathedral and church, starting with, of course, the Archangel Michael Cathedral in Cherkasy. It's showing exactly how radicalized the entire situation has become in the Ukraine. And, we've been kind of preparing people for bad news such as this because this was being announced over and over again. Radical Ukrainians have been posting about this on their Telegram channels, on their social media pages, that we will begin chasing after these Moscow, Russia-aligned churches and beating up Russian priests. And now it's literally taking place. So again, we need to pray for Metropolitan Theodosius and all of his flock in his quite big diocese, all the priests there, because who knows where these radicals will strike next, which cathedral, which church, and which monastery. And it could be a different diocese, or they could continue to pressure the unfortunately long-suffering Metropolitan Theodosius. And you can imagine the pressure he's under at the moment. And given all these hierarchs who've suffered heart attacks, strokes, health complications, not just from the beatings and harassment, but just from the psychological and, I would say, mental pressure of being under persecution is quite enormous. And hopefully Metropolitan Theodosius stays healthy, and there are those who will support him until the end, because he's really facing what a lot of Christians, I think, claim they are prepared for. But again, not everyone is ready to face persecution face to face like he is.
No, I definitely agree. And again, the video is it's wild. I know we've seen a lot of crazy videos out of Ukraine, but this is one of those ones where, people always, Protestants in America, they talk a lot about, they think the very early church is what they like to think about, the catacomb church, hiding from the Roman soldiers and, groups of mobs storming into the church and everything. And that's literally happening. And yet the average Protestant normie boomer would happily have a Ukraine flag and support all of this nonsense. So very, very unfortunate reality. But, speaking of the United States, the election is just a little bit over 2 weeks away. And it seems that, again, it's not even that interesting. I mean, it barely feels like an election year. I'm much more interested, and I think a lot of people are much more interested in the actual goings-on of these fronts amidst the Third World War, as opposed to this, fake nonsense, dumb two-party system election that we have going on. But, of course, it's getting closer and closer, and Trump is much closer in the polls than he ever was in 2016 or 2020, proving that, as I have said, he is, I think, the likely winner at this point. I believe a Trump victory is possible, and again, at this point, I don't really want to get into any of the details of the latest drama between this, that, or the other. It seems, again, according to the polls and according to a lot of things, Trump is headed to a potential victory. States like North Carolina, I think a lot of these natural disasters have turned things in his favor. And I think a lot of the escalations abroad are also somewhat helping him, as he very recently made some decent comments against war with Iran for the first time in a long time, because unfortunately before that they had been not the best comments in that regard. I think he did lose whatever advantage he had with Muslims when they swapped out Biden for Kamala. So there's been some back and forth amidst the demography of everybody's electorate that they're trying to win over. But I've heard a lot of people say this, and I think, as we know that many people are trying to seed this idea of a Iranian plot to assassinate Trump, I think the most devious plan that, the Jews could concoct would be they get Trump elected and then they assassinate him and blame it on the Iranians, because we know that Trump himself is ideologically against going to war with Iran, but he's surrounded himself with people who are not, specifically J.D. Vance, the PayPal mafia, all of Jared Kushner's crew, Brooke Rollins, Howard Lutnick, all of these types of people. Stephen Miller, of course, is getting retweeted by Trump. He's going to be involved, and he's an ultra-Zionist. So, Trump goes, and if they have any pretext at all to blame it on Iran, all these people will latch onto that, like ravenous wolves, to be like, yes, yes, and they will assault, and they will go, and they will declare full war on Iran, and they will rain nuclear hellfire with the United States Navy down on anybody that stands in their way if they can rally the support of the United States public behind some kind of horrible war to create greater Israel. So that's sort of my perspective on the whole thing. I know everybody else is, debating the economy and all this kind of thing, but I think in a lot of ways, a lot of that stuff's already baked into the cake. So sue me on that, but that's where a lot of that stuff is going. But unless you have anything else to say, Dimitri, I want to make sure everybody listens to our recent Ether Hour with Andrei Afanasyev. That was some really great analysis. We love having Andrei on as we speak. He's actually doing some great work on the front lines right now, talking to a lot of Orthodox battalions and whatnot. So it's very interesting stuff. And I think we're going to be talking to him more about all of that in the future after the election as well. And if you check that out, it'll be, of course, down in the link below. If you're listening on Substack or YouTube, you can check it out. We want to get your support, so you'll be able to listen to the full episode if you get behind that paywall. So worldwarnow.co, that is where you can find us everywhere, but I'll do more plugs at the very, very end. But unless you have anything else to say, Dimitri, you can kind of give us your final words on World War III analysis this week.
Yeah, no, some of the footage that Andrei Afanasyev has been posting actually has been incredibly promising. Notice the creation of the first Orthodox Christian battalion in the whole world dedicated to Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsar martyr. Amazing, right? On the front line. So Tsar Nicholas II, there's an official battalion dedicated to him, which again, he's such an important saint in the modern context, because everything that all those against him are exactly those who are currently concocting and, as you said, they're planning not just the Greater Israel project, but essentially the reigning of the Moshiach, right? So our final Katakon, who was martyred in 1918, his very image literally stokes hatred and fear amongst those people who, of course, killed Christ and martyred so many Orthodox Christians over the last few centuries. So it's a huge consideration. The Russians are actually using the Tsar as their sort of patron saint in this particular battalion. It's a very strong, and again, other saints include, there's Saint Alexander Nevsky, Saint Alexander Peresviet, Holy Prophet Elijah. There's all kinds of battalions. Andrei Afanasyev has a lot of information about that. Archangel Michael Battalion, but now Tsar Nicholas II has entered into that great collegium. So that's just wonderful news and very hopeful. Again, the Russian Orthodox monarchism is on the rise. And eventually, when the Russian Orthodox monarchy is restored, as per the prophecies which we discuss on this show, hopefully other nations will also be inspired to throw away this disgusting shroud of liberal democracy and essentially all the degeneracy that comes with it, because this is not the way of Christianity. It's not the way of various other religions, and it's the correct path forward, I think, especially for Orthodox Christian countries. It is the only sanctioned form of political government which the Holy Fathers and all of our great saints have spoken about. And there are many, many citations and great books about the subject, but many more will come out in the English language in the coming few years. So stay tuned, everyone. Thank you for your support. This has been a really, really good week, I think, Conrad, in terms of covering the various news around the world. But generally speaking, we can see that the Third World War is evolving, becoming a lot more complex. And hopefully, we pray that the rational common sense and the Christian-aligned forces in the world will eventually come out on top, despite how deadly and ferocious the combat will be in the near future.
Amen. I totally agree. And if people couldn't tell already, this episode, it's been hard to try to fit everything in my mind. I'm trying to balance all of these different fronts and these different updates. And right before I do the plugs here, just to leave it off with a prediction, because so many things could go down. I mean, I'm convinced that multiple countries' intelligence forces are waiting for us to record the show before acting decisively to completely cuck us out of breaking any stories. But we know that the Israeli strike, they have rumored that they want to strike the leadership of Iran, and I don't think they're necessarily talking about striking the Ayatollah himself or even Pezeshkian. I think they're talking about the leadership of the IRGC, because they group them in with Hezbollah, Hamas, and these other groups. So I wouldn't be surprised if Israel attempts to take out the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, Hossein Salami, as well as the current acting leader of the Quds forces, who's led by Ismail Khani, who was recently revealed to be alive in Iran. He was suspected to have been dead in the recent airstrikes that took out a lot of the Hezbollah and other Hamas leadership in Beirut in the aftermath of the Hassan Nasrallah assassination. So I wouldn't be surprised if those are the people that are targeted by Israel. That's perhaps my slight prediction, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Israel goes for more. So we're waiting for all of that, praying for peace, and I hope that, whatever Israel does, that Iran sticks to its words in its retaliation. But with all of that, thank you so much for listening. WorldWarNow.co, that's where you can find us and support us and listen to the full Andrei Afanasyev episode, listen to the full episode of us talking to Maram. All of the recent Ether Hours have been fantastic, so be sure to check that out. I want to thank all of our new subscribers for listening here to the end, if that is you. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, WorldWarNow_. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to follow World War Now on Telegram as well at World War Now Telly. Subscribe to the YouTube channel World War Now. We're doing more and more live streams there, as well as, potentially releasing some things that aren't just audio with, some visuals as well. So subscribe on all platforms if you haven't already, whether you're on Substack or YouTube. Be sure to get on the other one. And yeah, again, thank you so much for listening here to the very end to get behind the paywall. If you enjoy the show and want to support, listen to all, 50 plus episodes of the Ether Hour. The backlog is really relevant. Most of it isn't breaking news, so it's stuff that you can want to perennially listen to. It's really good stuff. So again, thank you so much for listening, and God bless. We will see you on the next one.